On the 21st April, Krusenstern passed between the Shetland and Orkney Islands in order to avoid the English Channel, where he might have met some French pirates, and after a good voyage he arrived at Kronstadt on the 7th August, 1806. Without taking first rank, like the expedition of Cook or that of La Pérouse, Krusenstern's trip was not without interest. We owe no great discovery to the Russian explorer, but he verified and rectified the work of his predecessors. This was in fact what most of the navigators of the 19th century had to do, the progress of science enabling them to complete what had been begun by others. Krusenstern had taken with him in his voyage round the world the son of the well-known dramatic author Kotzebue. The young Otto Kotzebue, who was then a cadet, soon gained his promotion, and he was a naval lieutenant when, in 1815, the command was given to him of the Rurik, a new brig with 2 guns, and a crew of no more than 27 men, equipped at the expense of Count Romanzoff. His task was to explore the less-known parts of Oceania and to cut a passage for his vessel across the frozen ocean. Kotzebue left the port of Kronstadt on the 15th July, 1815, put in first at Copenhagen and Plymouth, and after a very trying trip doubled Cape Horn and entered the Pacific Ocean on the 22nd January, 1816. After a halt at Talcahuano on the coast of Chile, he resumed his voyage, sighted the desert island of Salas of Gomez on the 26th March, and steered towards Easter Island, where he hoped to meet with the same friendly reception as Cook and Pérouse had done before him. The Russians had, however, hardly disembarked before they were surrounded by a crowd eager to offer them fruit and roots, by whom they were so shamelessly robbed that they were compelled to use their arms in self-defense, and to re-embark as quickly as possible to avoid the shower of stones flung at them by the natives. The only observation they had time to make during this short visit was the overthrow of the numerous huge stone statues described, measured, and drawn by Cook and La Pérouse. On the 16th April, the Russian captain arrived at the Dog Island of Schouten, which he called Doubtful Island, to mark the difference in his estimate of its position and that attributed to it by earlier navigators. Kotzebue gives it S lat. 44 degrees 50 and W long, 138 degrees 47. During the ensuing days were discovered the desert island of Romanzoff, so named in honor of the promoter of the expedition, Spiridoff Island with a lagoon in the center, the island Hora of the Paumotu group, the V-Legion chain of islets, and the no less extended group of the Krusenstern Islands. On the 28th April, the Rurik was near the supposed site of Bauman's Islands, but not a sign of them could be seen, and it appeared probable that the group had in fact been one of those already visited. As soon as he was safely out of the dangerous Paumotu archipelago, Kotzebue steered towards the group of islands sighted in 1788 by Sever, who, without touching at them, gave them the name of Penrhyn. The Russian explorer determined the position of the central group of islets as S lat. 9 degrees 135 and W long, 157 degrees 44, 32, characterizing them as very low like those of the Paumotu group, but inhabited for all that. At the sight of the vessel, a considerable fleet of canoes put off from the shore, and the natives, palm branches in their hands, advanced with the rhythmic sound of the paddles, serving as a kind of solemn and melancholy accompaniment to numerous singers. To guard against surprise, Kotzebue made all the canoes draw up on one side of the vessel, and bartering was done with a rope as the means of communication. The natives had nothing to trade with but bits of iron and fish hooks made of mother-of-pearl. They were well made and martial-looking, but wore no clothes beyond a kind of apron. At first only noisy and very lively, the natives soon became threatening. They thieved openly and answered remonstrances with undisguised taunts. Brandishing their spears above their heads, they seemed to be urging each other on to an attack. When Kotzebue felt that the moment had come to put an end to these hostile demonstrations, he had one gun fired. In the twinkling of an eye the canoes were empty, their terrified crews unpremeditatingly flinging themselves into the water with one accord. Presently the heads of the divers reappeared, and a little calmed down by the warning received, the natives returned to their canoes and their bartering. Nails and pieces of iron were much sought after by these people, whom Kotzebue likens to the natives of Naukahiva. They do not exactly tattoo themselves, but cover their bodies with large scars. In the twinkling of an eye the canoes were empty. In the twinkling of an eye the canoes were empty. A curious fashion not before noticed amongst the islanders of Oceania prevails amongst them. Most of them wear the nails very long, and those of the chief men in the canoes, extended 3 inches beyond the end of the finger. 36 boats manned by 360 men now surrounded the vessel, and Kotzebue, judging that with his feeble resources and the small crew of the Rurik any attempt to land would be imprudent, set sail again without being able to collect any more information on these wild and warlike islanders. Continuing his voyage towards Kamchatka, the navigator sighted on the 21st May 2 groups of islands connected by a chain of coral reefs. He named them Kudusov and Suwarov, determined their position, and made up his mind to come back and examine them again. The natives in fleet canoes approached the Rurik, but in spite of the pressing invitation of the Russians, would not trust themselves on board. They gazed at the vessel in astonishment, talked to each other with a vivacity which showed their intelligence, and flung on deck the fruit of the pandanus tree and coconuts. Their lank black hair, with flowers fastened in it here and there, the ornaments hung round their necks, their clothing of 2 curiously woven coloured mats tied to the waist, and reaching below the knee, but above all their frank and friendly countenances, distinguished the natives of the Marshall Archipelago from those of Penryn. On the 19th June, the Rurik put in at New Archangel, and for 28 days her crew were occupied in repairing her. On the 15th July Kotzebue set sail again, and 5 days later disembarked on Bering Island, the southern promontory of which he laid down in N lat. 55 degrees 17'18 and W long, 194 degrees 6'37. The natives Kotzebue met with on this island, like those of the North American coast, wore clothes made of seal skin and the intestines of the walrus. The lances used by them were pointed with the teeth of these amphibious animals. Their food consisted of the flesh of whales and seals, which they store in deep cellars dug in the earth. Their boats were made of leather, and they had sledges drawn by dogs. Their mode of salutation is strange enough. They first rub each other's noses and then pass their hands over their own stomachs, as if rejoicing over the swallowing of some tidbit. Lastly, when they want to be very friendly indeed, they spit in their own palms and rub their friends' faces with the spittle. The captain, still keeping his northerly course along the American coast, discovered Skitchmeth Bay, Sarichif Island, and lastly, an extensive gulf, the existence of which was not previously known. At the end of this gulf, Kotzebue hoped to find a channel through which he could reach the Arctic Ocean, but he was disappointed. He gave his own name to the gulf, and that of Krusenstern to the cape at the entrance. Driven back by bad weather, the Rurik reached Aunalashka on the 6th September, halted for a few days at San Francisco, and reached the Sandwich Islands, where some important surveys were made and some very curious information collected. On leaving the Sandwich Islands, Kotzebue steered for Suwarov and Kudusov Islands, which he had discovered a few months before. On the 1st January 1817, he sighted Maidi Island, to which he gave the name of New Year's Island. 4 days later he discovered a chain of little low wooded islands set in a framework of reefs, through which the vessel could scarcely make its way. Just at first the natives ran away at the sight of Lieutenant Skishmarov, but they soon came back with branches in their hands, shouting out the word Adara, friend. The officer repeated this word, and gave them a few nails in return, for which the Russians received the collars and flowers worn as neck ornaments by the natives. This exchange of courtesies emboldened the rest of the islanders to appear, and throughout the stay of the Russians in this archipelago, these friendly demonstrations and enthusiastic but guarded greetings were continued. One native, Rarik by name, was particularly cordial to the Russians, whom he informed that the name of his island and of the chain of islets and atolls too connected with it was Artdia. In acknowledgement of the cordial reception of the natives, Kotzebue left with them a cock and hen, and planted in a garden laid out under his orders a quantity of seeds, in the hope that they would thrive. But in this he did not make allowance for the number of rats which swarmed upon these islands and wrought havoc in his plantations. 2 atolls are coral islands like circular belts surrounding a smooth lagoon, Trans. On the 6th February, after ascertaining from what he was told by a chief named Langdiak that these sparsely populated islands were of recent formation, Kotzebue put to sea again, having first christened the archipelago Romantsov. The next day a group of islets, on which only 3 inhabitants were found, had its name of Iregup changed to that of Tichichikov, and then an enthusiastic reception was given to Kotzebue on the Kon Islands by the Taman or chief. Every native here feted the newcomers, some by their silence, like the queen forbidden by etiquette to answer the speeches made to her, some by their dances, cries and songs, in which the name of Totabu Kotzebue was constantly repeated. The chief himself came to fetch Kotzebue in a canoe and carried him on his shoulders through the breakers to the beach. In the oar group, the navigator noticed amongst a crowd of natives who climbed onto the vessel, 2 natives whose faces and tattooing seemed to mark them as of alien race. One of them, Kadu by name, especially pleased the commander, who gave him some bits of iron, and Kotzebue was surprised that he did not receive them with the same pleasure as his companions. This was explained the same evening. When all the natives were leaving the vessel, Kadu earnestly begged to be allowed to remain on the Rurik, and never again to leave it. The commander only yielded to his wishes after a great deal of persuasion. Kadu, says Kotzebue, had scarcely obtained permission when he turned quickly to his comrades who were waiting for him, declared to them his intention of remaining on board the ship, and distributed his iron among the chiefs. The astonishment in the boats was beyond description. They tried in vain to shake his resolution. He was immovable. At last his friend Edok came back, spoke long and seriously to him, and when he found that his persuasion was of no avail, he attempted to drag him by force. But Kadu now used the right of the strongest. He pushed his friend from him, and the boats sailed off. His resolution being inexplicable to me, I conceived a notion that he perhaps intended to steal during the night, and privately to leave the ship, and therefore had the night watch doubled, and his bed made up close to mine on the deck, where I slept on account of the heat. Kadu felt greatly honoured to sleep close to the tamman of the ship. Born at Hull, one of the Caroline Islands, more than 300 miles from the group where he was now living, Kadu, with Edok and 2 other fellow countrymen, had been overtaken when fishing by a violent storm. For 8 months the poor fellows were at the mercy of the winds and currents on a sea now smooth, now rough. They had never throughout this time been without fish, but they had suffered the cruelest tortures from thirst. When their stock of rainwater, which they had used very sparingly, was exhausted, there was nothing left to them to do but to fling themselves into the sea and try to obtain at the bottom of the ocean some water less impregnated with salt, which they brought to the surface in coconut shells pierced with a small opening. When they reached the Ore Islands, even the sight of land and the immediate prospect of safety did not rouse them from the state of prostration into which they had sunk. The sight of the iron instruments in the canoe of the strangers led the people of Ore to decide on their massacre for the sake of their treasures, but the Tamman, Tygidian by name, took them under his protection. 3 years had passed since this event, and the men from the Caroline Islands, thanks to their more extended knowledge, soon acquired a certain ascendancy over their hosts. When the Rurik appeared, Kadu was in the woods a long way from the coast. He was sent for at once, as he was looked upon as a great traveller, and he might perhaps be able to say what the great monster approaching the island was. Now Kadu had more than once seen European vessels, and he persuaded his friends to go and meet the strangers, and to receive them kindly. Such had been Kadu's adventures. He now remained on the Rurik, identified the other islands of the archipelago, and lost no time in facilitating intercourse between the Russians and the natives. Dressed in a yellow mantle, and wearing a red cap like a convict, Kadu looked down upon his old friends, and seemed not to recognize them. When a fine old man with a flowing beard named Tygidian came on board, Kadu undertook to explain to him and his companions the working of the vessel and the use of everything about the ship. Like many Europeans, he made up for his ignorance by imperturbable assurance, and had an answer ready for every question. Interrogated on the subject of a little box from which a sailor took a black powder and applied it to his nostrils, Kadu glibly told some most extraordinary stories, and wound up with a practical illustration by putting the box against his own nose. He then flung it from him, sneezing violently and screaming so loud that his terrified friends fled away on every side. But when the crisis was over, he managed to turn the incident to his own advantage. Kadu gave Kotzebue some general information about the group of islands then under examination, and the Russians spent a month in taking surveys, and see all these islands, which the natives call Radak, were under the control of one Tamman, a man named Lamory. A few years later Dumont d'Urville gave the name of Marshal to the group. According to Kadu, another chain of islets, atolls, and reefs was situated some little distance off on the west. Kotzebue had not time to identify them, and steering in a northerly direction he reached Aunalashka on the 24th April, where he had to repair the serious damage sustained by the Rurik in 2 violent storms. This done, he took on board some Badair's boats cased in skins to make them watertight, with 15 natives of the Aleutian Islands, who were used to the navigation of the polar seas, and resumed his exploration of Bering Strait. Kotzebue had suffered very much from pain in his chest ever since when, doubling Cape Horn, He had been knocked down by a huge wave and flung overboard, an accident which would have cost him his life had he not clung to some rope. The consequences were so serious to his health that, when on the 10th July he landed on the island of St. Lawrence, he was obliged to give up the further prosecution of his researches. On the 1st October, the Rurik made a second short halt at the Sandwich Islands, where seeds and animals were landed, and at the end of the month, the explorers landed at Arctic, in the midst of the enthusiastic acclamations of the natives. The cats brought by the visitors were welcomed with special enthusiasm, for the island was infested with immense numbers of rats, who worked havoc on the plantations. Great also was the rejoicing over the return of Kadu, with whom the Russians left an assortment of tools and weapons, which made their owner the wealthiest inhabitant of the archipelago. Interior of a house at Radek. Interior of a house at Radek. Facsimile of early engraving. On the 4th November, the Rurik left the Radek Islands, after identifying the Legip group, and cast anchor off Guam, one of the Marian Islands, where she remained until the end of the month. A halt of some weeks at Manila enabled the commander to collect some curious information about the Philippine Islands, to which he would have to return later. After escaping from the violent storms encountered in doubling the Cape of Good Hope, the Rurik cast anchor on the 3rd August, 1818, in the Neva, opposite Count Romantsov's palace. These 3 years of absence had been turned to good account by the hardy navigators. In spite of the smallness of their number and the poverty of their equipments, they had not been afraid to face the terrors of the deep, to venture amongst all but unknown archipelagos, or to brave the rigors of the Arctic and torrid zones. Important as were their actual discoveries, their rectification of the errors of their predecessors were of yet greater value. 2,500 species of plants, 1/3 of which were quite new, with numerous details respecting the language, ethnography, religion, and customs of the tribes visited, formed a rich harvest attesting the zeal, skill, and knowledge of the captain, as well as the intrepidity and endurance of his crew. When, therefore, the Russian government decided in 1823 to send reinforcements to Kamchatka to put an end to the contraband trade carried on in Russian America, the command of the expedition was given to Kotzebue. A frigate called the Prowess was placed at his disposal, and he was left free to choose his own route both going and returning. Kotzebue had gone round the world as a midshipman with Krusenstern, and that explorer now entrusted to him his eldest son, as did also Mahler, the Minister of Marine, a proof of the great confidence both fathers placed in him. The expedition left Kronstadt on the 15th August, 1823, reached Rio de Janeiro in safety, doubled Cape Horn on the 15th January, 1824, and steered for the Pomatu archipelago, where Prowess Island was discovered and the islands of Arikchedus, Romantsov, Karlshof, and Palaiser were identified. On the 14th March, anchor was cast in the harbour of Matavar, Artahate. View of Artahate. View of Artahate. Since Cook's stay in this archipelago, a complete transformation had taken place in the manners and customs of the inhabitants. In 1799, some missionaries settled in Artahate, where they remained for 10 years, unfortunately without making a single conversion, and we add with regret without even winning the esteem or respect of the natives, compelled at the end of these 10 years, in consequence of the revolutions which convulsed Artahate, to take refuge at Imeo and other islands of the same group. Their efforts were there crowned with more success. In 1817, Palmer, king of Artahate, recalled the missionaries, made them a grant of land, and declared himself a convert to Christianity. His example was soon followed by a considerable number of natives. Kotzebue had heard of this change, but he was not prepared to find European customs generally adopted. At the sound of the discharge announcing the arrival of the Russians, a boat, bearing the Artahatian flag, put off from shore, bringing a pilot to guide the Prowess to its anchorage. The next day, which happened to be Sunday, the Russians were surprised at the religious silence which prevailed throughout the island when they landed. This silence was only broken by the sound of canticles and psalms sung by the natives in their huts. The church, a plain, clean building of rectangular form, roofed with reeds and approached by a long avenue of palms, was well filled with an attentive, orderly congregation, the men sitting on one side, the women on the other, all with prayer books in their hands. The voices of the neophytes often joined in the chant of the missionaries, unfortunately with better will than correctness or appropriateness. If the piety of the islanders was edifying, The costumes worn by these strange converts were such as somewhat to distract the attention of the visitors. A black coat or the waistcoat of an English uniform was the only garment worn by some, whilst others contented themselves with a jacket, a shirt, or a pair of trousers. The most fortunate were wrapped in cloth mantles, and rich and poor alike dispensed with shoes and stockings. The women were no less grotesquely clad. Some wore men's shirts, white or striped as the case might be, others a mere piece of cloth, but all had European hats. The wives of the Ariwa three wore coloured robes, a piece of great extravagance, but with them the dress formed the whole costume. 3. The Ariwa are a curious, vagrant set of people, who have been found in these regions, who practice the singular and fatal custom of killing their children at birth, because of a traditional law binding them to do so. Trans. On the Monday, a most imposing ceremony took place. This was the visit to Kotzebue of the Queen Mother and the royal family. These great people were preceded by a master of ceremonies, who was a sort of court fool wearing nothing but a red waistcoat, and with his legs tattooed to represent striped trousers, whilst on the lower portion of his back was described a quadrant divided into minute sections. He performed his absurd capers, contortions, and grimaces with a gravity infinitely amusing. The Queen Regent carried the little King Palmer Roman III. In her arms and beside her walked his sister, a pretty child of 10 years old. The royal infant was dressed in European style like his subjects, and like them, he wore nothing on his feet. At the request of the ministers and great people of Arctic, Kotzebue had a pair of boots made for him, which he was to wear on the day of his coronation. Great were the shouts of joy, the gestures of delight, and the envious exclamations over the trifles distributed amongst the ladies of the court, and fierce were the struggles for the smallest shreds of the imitation gold lace given away. What important matter could have brought so many men on to the deck of the frigate, bearing with them quantities of fruits and figs? These eager messengers were the husbands of the disappointed ladies of Arctic, who had not been present at the division of the gold, lace more valuable in their eyes than rivers of diamonds in those of Europeans. At the end of 10 days, Kotzebue decided to leave this strange country, where civilization and barbarism flourished side by side in a manner so fraternal, and steered for the Samoa archipelago, notorious for the massacre of the companions of La Perouse. How great was the difference between the Samoans and the Otaheitans! Wild and fierce, suspicious and threatening, the natives of Rose Island could scarcely be kept off the deck of the Prowess, and one of them, at the sight of the bare arm of a sailor, made a savage and eloquent gesture, showing with what pleasure he could devour the firm and doubtless savoury flesh displayed to view. The insolence of the natives increased with the arrival of more canoes from the shore, and they had to be beaten back with boat hooks before the Prowess could get away from amongst the frail boats of the ferocious islanders. Upolu or Oyalava, Platte and Polar or Savai Islands, which with Rose Island form part of the Navigator or Samoan group, were passed almost as soon as they were sighted, and Kotzebue steered for the Radek Islands, where he had been so kindly received on his first voyage. This time, however, the natives were terrified at sight of the huge vessel, and piled up their canoes or fled into the interior, whilst on the beach a procession was formed, a number of islanders with palm branches in their hands advancing to meet the intruders and beg for peace. At this sight, Kotzebue flung himself into a boat with the surgeon Eschkoltz, and rowing rapidly towards the shore, shouted, "Totabu Adara, Kotzebue friend." An immediate change was the result. The petitions the natives were going to address to the Russians were converted into shouts and enthusiastic demonstrations of delight, some rushing forwards to welcome their friend, others running over to announce his arrival to their fellow countrymen. The commander was very pleased to find that Kadu was still living at Ore, under the protection of Lamory, whose countenance he had secured at the price of half his wealth. Of all the animals left here by Kotzebue, the cats, now become wild alone, had survived, and thus far they had not destroyed the legions of rats with which the island was overrun. The explorer remained several days with his friends, whom he entertained with dramatic representations, and on the 6th May he made for the Legip group, the examination of which he had left uncompleted on his last voyage. After surveying it, he intended to resume his exploration of the Radek Islands, but bad weather prevented this, and he had to set sail for Kamchatka. The crew here enjoyed the rest so fully earned, from the 7th June to the 20th July, when Kotzebue set sail for New Archangel on the American coast, where he cast anchor on the 7th August. The frigate, which was here to take the place of the Prowess, was not, however, ready for sea until the 1st March of the following year, and Kotzebue turned the delay to account by visiting the Sandwich Islands, where he cast anchor off Oahu in December 1824. The harbour of Honokuru or Honolulu is the safest of the archipelago. A good many vessels therefore put in there even at this early date, and the island of Oahu bid fair to become the most important of the group, supplanting Hawaii or Oahe. The appearance of the town was already semi-European. Stone houses replaced the primitive native huts, regular streets with shops, café, public houses, much patronized by the sailors of whalers and fur traders, together with a fortress provided with cannon, were the most noteworthy signs of the rapid transformation of the manners and customs of the natives. 50 years had now elapsed since the discovery of most of the islands of Oceania, and everywhere changes had taken place as sudden as those in the Sandwich Islands. The fur trade, says Disborough Cooley, carried on with the northwest coast of America, has effected a wonderful revolution in the Sandwich Islands, which from their situation offered an advantageous shelter for ships engaged in it. Among these islands the fur traders wintered, refitted their vessels, and replenished their stock of fresh provisions, and as summer approached, returned to complete their cargo on the coast of America. Iron tools and, above all, guns were eagerly sought for by the islanders in exchange for their provisions, and the mercenary traders, regardless of consequences, readily gratified their desires. Firearms and ammunition, being the most profitable stock to traffic with, were supplied them in abundance. Hence the Sandwich Islanders soon became formidable to their visitors. They seized on several small vessels, and displayed an energy tinctured at first with barbarity, but indicating great capabilities of social improvement. At this period, one of those extraordinary characters which seldom fail to come forth when fate is charged with great events, completed the revolution, which had its origin in the impulse of Europeans. Tameha, a chief who had made himself conspicuous during the last and unfortunate visit of Cook to those islands, usurped the authority of king, subdued the neighbouring islands with an army of 16,000 men, and made his conquests subservient to his grand schemes of improvement. He knew the superiority of Europeans, and was proud to imitate them. Already in 1796, when Captain Broughton visited those islands, the usurper sent to ask him whether he should salute him with great guns. He always kept Englishmen about him as ministers and advisers. In 1817, he is said to have had an army of 7,000 men, armed with muskets, among whom were at least 50 Europeans. Tameha, who began his career in blood and usurpation, lived to gain the sincere love and admiration of his subjects, who regarded him as more than human, and mourned his death with tears of warmer affection than often bedew the ashes of royalty. One of the guard of the King of the Sandwich Islands. Facsimile of early engraving. Such was the state of things when the Russian expedition put in at Oahu. The young King Riorio was in England with his wife, and the government of the archipelago was in the hands of the Queen Mother, Kahumanu. Kotzebue took advantage of the latter, and of the First Minister both being absent on a neighbouring island, to pay a visit to another wife of Kamiami. The apartment, says the traveller, was furnished in the European fashion with chairs, tables, and looking-glasses. In one corner stood an immensely large bed with silk curtains. The floor was covered with fine mats, and on these in the middle of the room lay Namahana, extended on her stomach, her head turned towards the door and her arms supported on a silk pillow. Namahana, who appeared at the utmost not more than 40 years old, was exactly 6 feet 2 inches high, and rather more than 2 ells in circumference. Her coal-black hair was neatly plaited, at the top of a head as round as a ball. Her flat nose and thick projecting lips were certainly not very handsome, yet was her countenance on the whole prepossessing and agreeable. The good lady remembered having seen Kotzebue 10 years before. She therefore received him graciously, but she could not speak of her husband without tears in her eyes, and her grief did not appear to be assumed. In order that the date of his death should be ever present to her mind, she had the inscription 6th May, 1819, branded on her arm. A zealous Christian, like most of the population, the Queen took Kotzebue to the church, a vast but simple building, not nearly so crowded as that at Otaheite. Namahana seemed to be very intelligent. She knew how to read and was specially enthusiastic about writing, that art which connects us with the absent. Being anxious to give the commander a proof alike of her affection and of her acquirements, she sent him a letter by hand which it had taken her several weeks to concoct. The other ladies did not like to be outdone, and Kotzebue found himself overwhelmed with documents. The only means to check this epistolatory inundation was to weigh anchor, which the captain did without loss of time. Before his departure, he received Queen Namahana on board. Her Majesty appeared in her robes of ceremony, consisting of a magnificent peach-coloured silk dress embroidered with black, evidently originally made for a European, and consequently too tight and too short for its wearer. People could therefore see not only the feet, beside which those of Charlemagne would have looked like a Chinaman's, and which were cased in huge men's boots, but also a pair of fat, brown, naked legs resembling the balustrades of a terrace. A collar of red and yellow feathers, a garland of natural flowers serving as a gorget, and a hat of leghorn straw, trimmed with artificial flowers, completed this fine but absurd costume. Namahana went over the ship, asking questions about everything, and at last, worn out with seeing so many wonders, betook herself to the captain's cabin, where a good collation was spread for her. The queen flung herself upon a couch, but the fragile article of furniture was unable to sustain so much majesty, and gave way beneath the weight of a princess, whose embonpoint had doubtless had a good deal to do with her elevation to such high rank. After this Holt Kotzebue returned to New Archangel, where he remained until the 30th July, 1825. He then paid another visit to the Sandwich Islands, a short time after Admiral Byron had brought back the remains of the king and queen. The archipelago was then at peace, its prosperity was continually on the increase, the influence of the missionaries was confirmed, and the education of the young monarch was in the hands of missionary Bingham. The inhabitants were deeply touched by the honours accorded by the English to the remains of their sovereigns, and the day seemed to be not far distant when European customs would completely supersede those of the natives. Some provisions having been embarked at Waihu, the explorer made for Radeck Islands, identified the pescadores, forming the southern extremity of that chain, discovered the Eschscholtz group, a short distance off, and touched at Guam on the 15th October. On the 23rd January, 1826, he left Manila after a stay of some months, during which constant intercourse with the natives had enabled him to add greatly to our knowledge of the geography and natural history of the Philippine Islands. A new Spanish governor had arrived with a large reinforcement of troops, and had so completely crushed all agitation that the colonists had quite given up their scheme of separating themselves from Spain. On the 10th July 1826, the Pretty returned to Kronstadt, after a voyage extending over 3 years, during which she had visited the northwest coast of America, the Aleutian Islands, Kamchatka and the Sea of Arctic, surveyed minutely a great part of the Radeck Islands, and obtained fresh information on the changes through which the people of Oceania were passing. Thanks to the ardour of Chamisso and Professor Eschscholtz, many specimens of natural history had been collected, and the latter published a description of more than 2,000 animals, as well as some curious details on the mode of formation of the coral islands in the South Seas. The English government had now resumed with eagerness the study of the tantalizing problem, the solution of which had been sought so long in vain. We allude to the finding of the Northwest Passage. When Perry by sea and Franklin by land were trying to reach Bering Strait, Captain Frederick William Beechey received instructions to penetrate as far north as possible by way of the same strait so as to meet the other explorers, who would doubtless arrive in a state of exhaustion from fatigue and privation. The Blossom, Captain Beechey commander, set sail from Spithead on the 19th May, 1825, and after doubling Cape Horn on the 26th December, entered the Pacific Ocean. After a short stay off the coast of Chile, Beechey visited Easter Island, where the same incidents which had marked Kotzebue's visit were repeated. The same eager reception on the part of the natives, who swam to the Blossom or brought their poultry merchandise to it in canoes, and the same shower of stones and blows from clubs when the English landed, repulsed, as in the Russian explorers' time, with a rapid discharge of shot. On the 4th December, Captain Beechey sighted an island completely overgrown with vegetation. This was the spot famous for the discovery on it of the descendants of the mutineers of the Bounty, who landed on it after the enactment of a tragedy, which at the end of last century had excited intense public interest in England. In 1780, one Lieutenant Bligg, one of the officers who had distinguished himself under Cook, was appointed to the command of the Bounty, and received orders to go to Otaheite, there to obtain specimens of the breadfruit tree and other of its vegetable productions for transportation to the Antilles, then generally known amongst the English as the Western Indies. After doubling Cape Horn, Bligg cast anchor in the Bay of Matavai, where he shipped a cargo of breadfruit trees, proceeding thence to Ramauka, one of the Tonga Isles, for more of the same valuable growth. Thus far no special incident marked the course of the voyage, which seemed likely to end happily. But the haughty character and stern, despotic manners of the commander had alienated from him the affections of nearly the whole of his crew. A plot was formed against him, which was carried out before sunrise on the 28th April, off Tafona. Surprised by the mutineers while still in bed, Bligh was bound and gagged before he could defend himself, and dragged on deck in his nightshirt. And after a mock trial, presided over by Lieutenant Christian Fletcher, he, with 18 men who remained faithful to him, was lowered into a boat containing a few provisions, and abandoned in the open sea. After enduring agonies of hunger and thirst, and escaping from terrible storms, and from the teeth of the savage natives of Tafona, Bligh succeeded in reaching Timor Island, where he received an enthusiastic welcome. "I now desired my people to come on shore," says Bligh, "which was as much as some of them could do, being scarce able to walk. They, however, were helped to the house, and found tea with bread and butter provided for their breakfast. Our bodies were nothing but skin and bones, our limbs were full of sores, and we were clothed in rags. In this condition, with the tears of joy and gratitude flowing down our cheeks, the people of Timor beheld us with a mixture of horror, surprise, and pity. Thus, through the assistance of divine providence, we surmounted the difficulties and distresses of a most perilous voyage." Perilous indeed, for it had lasted no less than 41 days in latitudes but little known, in an open boat, with insufficient food, want and exposure causing infinite suffering. Yet in this voyage of more than 1,500 leagues but one man was lost, a sailor who fell a victim at the beginning of the journey to the natives of Tafona. The fate of the mutineers was strange, and more than one lesson may be learnt from it. They made for Otaheite, where provisions were obtained, and those who had been least active in the mutiny were abandoned, and thence Christian set sail with 8 sailors, who elected to remain with him, and some 22 natives, men and women from Otaheite and Taubani. Nothing more was heard of them. As for those who remained at Otaheite, they were taken prisoners in 1791 by Captain Edwards of the Pandora, sent out by the English government in search of them and the other mutineers, with orders to bring them to England. Of the 10 who were brought home by the Pandora, only 3 were condemned to death. 20 years passed by before the slightest light was thrown on the fate of Christian and those he took with him. In 1808 an American trading vessel touched at Pitcairn, there to complete her cargo of seal skins. The captain imagined the island to be uninhabited, but to his very great surprise, a canoe presently approached his ship manned by 3 young men of colour, who spoke English very well. Greatly astonished, the commander questioned them, and learnt that their father had served under Bligh. The fate of the latter was now known to the whole world, and its discussion had lightened the tedious hours in the forecastles of vessels of every nationality. And the American captain, reminded by the singular incident related above of the disappearance of so many of the mutineers of the Bounty, landed on the island, where he met an Englishman named Smith, who had belonged to the crew of that vessel, and who made the following confession. When he left Otaheite, Christian made direct for Pitcairn, attracted to it by its lonely situation, south of the Paumotu Islands, and out of the general track of vessels. After landing the provisions of the Bounty, and taking away all the fittings which could be of any use, the mutineers burnt the vessel not only with a view to removing all trace of their whereabouts, but also to prevent the escape of any of their number. From the first, the sight of the extensive marshes led them to believe the island to be uninhabited, and they were soon convinced of the justice of this opinion. Huts were built and land was cleared, but the English charitably assigned to the natives, whom they had carried off or who had elected to join them, the position of slaves. 2 years passed by without any serious dissensions arising, but at the end of that time the natives laid a plot against the whites, of which, however, the latter were informed by an Otaheitan woman, and the 2 leaders paid for their abortive attempt with their lives. 2 more years of peace and tranquility ensued, and then another plot was laid, this time resulting in the massacre of Christian and 5 of his comrades. The murder, however, was avenged by the native women, who mourned for their English lovers and killed the surviving men of Otaheite. A little later, the discovery of a plant from which a kind of brandy could be made caused the death of one of the 4 Englishmen still remaining. Another was murdered by his companions, a third died a natural death, and the last one, Smith, took the name of Adams and lived on at the head of a community, consisting of 10 women and 19 children, the eldest of whom were but 7 or 8 years old. This man, who had reflected on his errors and repented of them, now led a new life, fulfilling the duties of father, priest, and sovereign, his combined firmness and justice acquiring for him an all-powerful influence over his motley subjects. This strange teacher of morality, who in his youth had set all laws at defiance, and to whom no obligation was sacred, now preached pity, love, and sympathy, arranged regular marriages between the children of different parents, his little community thriving lustily under the mild yet firm control of one who had but lately turned from his own evil ways. Such at the time of Beechey's arrival was the state of the colony at Pitcairn. The navigator, well received by the inhabitants, whose virtuous conduct recalled the Golden Age, remained amongst them 18 days. The village consisted of clean, well-built huts, surrounded by pandanus and cocoa palms. The fields were well cultivated, and under Adam's tuition the young people had made implements of agriculture of really extraordinary excellence. The faces of these half-breeds were good-looking and pleasant in expression, and their figures were well proportioned, showing unusual muscular development. The village consisted of clean, well-built huts. After leaving Pitcairn, Beechey visited Crescent, Gambier, Hood, Clermont, Tunnerra, Searles, Whitsunday, Queen Charlotte, Tehai, and the Lancer Islands, all in the Paumotu group, and an islet to which he gave the name of Byam Martin. Here the explorer met a native named Tunwary, who had been shipwrecked in a storm. Having left Anna with 500 fellow countrymen in 3 canoes to render homage to Palmer Roman III, who had just ascended the throne, Tunwary had been driven out of his course by westerly winds. These were succeeded by variable breezes, and provisions were soon so completely exhausted that the survivors had to feed on the bodies of those who were the first to succumb. Finally, Tunwary arrived at Barrow Island in the center of the dangerous archipelago, where he obtained a small stock of provisions, and after a long delay, his canoe having been stove in off Byam Martin, once more put to sea. Beechey yielded under considerable persuasion to Tunwary's entreaty to be received on board with his wife and children, and taken to Otaheite. The next day, by one of those strange chances seldom occurring except in fiction, Beechey stopped at Hyen, where Tunwary met his brother, who had supposed him to be long since dead. After the first transports of delight and surprise, the 2 natives sat down side by side, and holding each other's hands related their several adventures. Beechey left Hyen on the 10th February, sighted Melville and Croker Islands, and cast anchor on the 18th off Otaheite, where he had some difficulty in obtaining provisions. The natives now demanded good Chilean dollars and European clothing, both of which were altogether wanting on the Blossom.